Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Q4 Meetings Check-in Q&A webinar featuring Legalese with the Ladies. We're going to get started here in about 1 minute. Going to let folks trickle in, and we'll get rolling. Thanks, everyone, for attending live, and we're excited for today's session. Great to see so many familiar names. Happy Friday to you as well, Bob. I should have mentioned that to start. Happy Friday, everyone.
Yeah, glad to be a Friday.
Yes, it is. For those of you who are just joining, we're going to get started in about 1 minute. All right, ready to get started. Okay, so again, thanks for everyone for attending today's webinar. For those folks that are new to our webinars, we do these on a quarterly basis, and the goal of these webinars is to provide an opportunity to folks around the industry to be able to voice questions, challenges, learnings, and to really share across the industry is our main goal. So we appreciate everybody's attendance. We appreciate everybody's kind feedback from past webinar sessions, and we're always looking for feedback from you folks to make these sessions even better. So again, thank you for everyone joining. Today's agenda is going to be the majority Q&A focused. We'll first start with a few minutes sharing kind of what we're seeing from HopSkip's angle, as well as Barbara and Lisa's perspective on kind of current state of the industry. And then we're going to jump right into Q&A, and we will be addressing the questions that were submitted in advance of the webinar. So just to give everybody a quick background kind of who we are, what we do. My name is Sean Whalin. I am a co-founder and the CEO of HopSkip. For those of you that might not be familiar with HopSkip, HopSkip is a platform that streamlines how meeting and event professionals source and book meeting and events at hotels. So we work with professional meeting and event planners, national sales folks from across the chains, DMOs and CVBs, and of course, sales teams from hotels. Lisa, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everybody, good morning. I'm Lisa Sommer Devlin. I'm an attorney based in Phoenix, Arizona. And for most of my career, I have focused on representing the hotel side of the industry, negotiating contracts, dealing with attrition, cancellation, and of course, for the past 2 years, dealing with force majeure and COVID. And I'll throw it over to my good friend and colleague, Barbara. Jump in.
Thank you. Good day, everyone. I'm Barbara Dunn. I'm an attorney with Barnes & Thornburg in Chicago, representing all types of nonprofit corporations as well as for-profit corporations in connection with negotiating meetings for events, contract, trade shows, and the like. And happy to be engaged in this conversation today with Lisa and our good friends at HopSkip.
Awesome. Thank you both. And we're going to always show this slide in every one of our webinars. Legal disclaimer, today's presentation is not legal advice. We're lucky enough to have two great partners with Lisa and Barbara, one of course representing groups and one representing hotels, but this is just purely kind of insights and sharing learnings, not necessarily legal advice. Barbara or Lisa, anything you want to add to that disclaimer?
No, I mean, that kind of says it all. The point is every case is unique. And so while we can give broad general statements about the law and trends, we certainly can't opine on particular situations.
Perfect. Now that we got that out of the way, we're going to first start with a poll question. The question that we have for folks in the audience is, what is your top challenge? And I should mention this is specifically for planners. What is your top challenge that you've faced so far this year when sourcing events in 2022? Looks like we have the poll distributed and answers are coming in as we speak. Top answer as of now is response time. Oh, yeah, response time from hotels, with a close second of calculating hidden fees and total projected costs. And that's interesting because it seems to be a similar trend from the last webinar. Those were the two top challenges. Thank you to everyone who participated in the poll question. One of the things that we will be distributing next week, along with the recorded version of the webinar, is the answers to the poll questions as well. Okay. So sourcing and contracting with hotels in 2022, what we're seeing, I'll first start off from the HopSkip side and then pass it over to Barbara and Lisa. And from our perspective, since we're, of course, not planners ourselves or hotel sales folks ourselves, we're the platform that sits in between those two key players. And what we're seeing from the HopSkip lens is definitely we're seeing lead times shrinking for when event start dates are occurring. We're seeing compression in tier 1 cities. We're seeing more tier 2 and tier 3 cities getting sourced on the platform, which is exciting. And we're also seeing different and higher quantity of contract terms and clauses being requested from planners to have in their hotel contracts. I'll pass it over to you, Lisa, if you'd like to share kind of what you're seeing from your side of the table.
Sure. Thanks, Sean. From the hotel perspective, what I'm seeing is a lot of concern and uncertainty on the part of the groups that are booking contracts. And so they are wanting some extra clauses, some of which we'll talk about today, to try and hedge their bets, so to speak, which makes it difficult for the hotels because they need what I would call real business, business that is definite, that they can count on, that they know is coming. And so it creates a real struggle between the two sides to try and address those kinds of issues. I think you're right that there's some date compression because groups are waiting to book in order to see how things are going. But I am seeing some association business coming back that, I'm booking contracts for 26 and 27 at this point. And a lot of those longer term things, they want a lot of wiggle room in their contracts that the hotels, after the downturn from COVID, really aren't comfortable with because they need to get that business back on the books. So there is that struggle. And those are the main things that I'm seeing. Barbara, what are you seeing?
Thanks, Lisa. So the flexibility that you're referring to is really been mission critical for the groups to get back out there, to have these in-person meetings and events and trade shows. So that said, I, like you, am seeing clients go back to more familiar type booking lead patterns, booking time lead patterns. So larger meetings citywide, 5 to 7 years out. So like you, I'm seeing contracts farther out. At the same time, certainly the groups are hedging the bets on their own side, wanting to get exhibitors, attendees back, sponsors, etc. So the flexibility that they're seeking, certainly when it relates to room blocks, pickup, food and beverage minimums, and the like, I think that's a trend that's going to continue for a while. I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of hotels wanting to know what's the minimum value of your business. What should I assess for that? And I think groups are evolving in that dialogue. Many have had in-person meetings, so they have a good sense of what those might look like. Because previous to that, we were looking obviously back to 2019, which wasn't such a good bellwether going forward. So I think that is happening. At the same time, groups are really working hard at looking at the format and program and scheduling for their meetings. Do they need it to be a 4-day meeting? Do they need to have these other functions? To some extent, the genie's out of the bottle when it comes to virtual meetings and virtual access, so that many organizations have condensed meetings which might have otherwise occurred on site and do those ahead of time or afterwards virtually. And so that is having an impact as well, and certainly something we're looking at. Lots of contract modifications. Again, right sizing, if you will, of contracts. I mean, we saw that back from 2008, the financial downturn. We're still seeing a little bit of that. Although I agree, my clients are experiencing the compression in the marketplace. There's limited supply of hotels coming online. A lot of construction and renovation had been delayed because of delays with supply chain, et cetera. So it's definitely a squeeze. A lot of clients are being pushed to sign contracts because they don't have other options. That puts a difficult position in the negotiations. Having said that, we're not necessarily recommending new clauses, but certainly having groups kind of assess the need for existing clauses. And if they're pushed in a tough negotiation, let's say, where they really need this space, are they able to access and assess the risk associated with not having the best clause that they want, whether it's force majeure or attrition or whatever the case may be. And that kind of evaluation is something groups are becoming a little bit more skilled with, because they have to be, because the clauses are changing on both sides, and evaluating whether I really need this change, is the risk worth the benefit, and kind of evaluating that. And we can use as a measure some of the disputes that are still trying to get resolved from COVID-related cancellation or attrition, as a way to say, what's the tolerance? Maybe dispute resolution does matter. Attorneys' fees do matter. And, how hard do I want to push on these clauses? So it's an ever-evolving landscape from the group's perspective. But I agree with Lisa and a lot of these trends, Sean. I'm seeing that same thing across my desk from the group side, and perhaps some of our participants in the webinar are today. So we're hoping to highlight a few clauses, as Lisa mentioned, but more importantly, focus on some strategies that we see working from our perspectives. John?
And I would add to that Barbara's right on all those points. And from the hotel's perspective, after what they've been through the last 2 years, and in particular in 2022, where there's been what I would call trailing cancellations and trailing issues with attrition, hotels have been burned a lot and have lost a lot of business. And so from the hotel perspective, they're not as willing to say, oh, let's take the risk on these clauses, because what are the odds it's going to happen? Well, it's happened a lot in the last year. And so hotels are being much firmer. Again, going back to that, they need real business aspect of it. And so I'm seeing that hotels are saying, I'd rather have good business that I know it's going to materialize than business that is really just speculative. And so I'm seeing hotels that are willing to walk away from customers that are insisting on clauses that are just too loose for them to be able to put that business on their books. So it's something to think about.
Great point. Yeah, and we're seeing that exact same thing. Appreciate both of your inputs on that. We'll flip to the next slide, where we're going to give a quick plug for those that are not aware. We have a resource center available on HopSkip that houses resources specifically around sourcing and contracting, and these resources were made from Lisa and Barbara. So I know that the folks on today's webinar and our past webinars are big fans of Lisa and Barbara. And I know not all folks are able to attend live. So going to the Resource Center on the HopSkip website is a great place to capture a lot of the information that we're talking about today. And it is consistently updated with fresh and new resources as well. So I believe we're sending out a link to be able to access that. And you can find the Resource Center by going to www.myhopskip.com. All right, let's jump into the next poll question, and then we're going to start with the Q&A. So the next poll question we have is for planners. How do you communicate cost savings to your stakeholders or clients when booking events? We know, based on today's current economic climate, cost savings is something that's top of mind for a lot of different organizations. So we're curious to know how you're able to, or if you are communicating cost savings to your internal stakeholders or to your clients if you're a third-party planner. It looks like the majority of folks are highlighting that the way that they do communicate cost savings is through emails and kind of homegrown spreadsheets. And then the second answer that has the most responses would be, we're not currently communicating cost savings. Awesome. So appreciate everybody responding to that poll question. We're going to jump into our first Q&A. All right. So what is the best way to handle attrition contract language and situations post-COVID? Barbara or Lisa, do one of you want to kick this off?
Barbara, you start.
Yeah, so I'll jump in. I mean, my response won't surprise anybody because it's the same that it's been for 30 years now in terms of at least dealing with attrition related issues. And if I'm saying from the group's perspective, I'm saying to my hotel counterpart, what minimum amount of the block do I have to use in order to not avoid writing you a check for attrition fees? You know, that's sort of the $1 million, if you will, question when it comes to attrition fees, because the fact of the matter is, to Lisa's point, in the marketplace will demand that while hotels are willing to give groups some cushion of what's expected to be utilized in rooms and what's actually utilized, that cushion could be shrinking at any given time. So it's important to really focus on that threshold question. So my strategy is to focus on that minimum target. Now, ideally, from the group's perspective, attrition would be based on room count as opposed to room revenue. And Lisa have a different perspective on that. But certainly, you know, when we look at folks booking outside the block, we can, on a room count basis, we can pick up rooms of folks coming in the door through other means, and that moves the needle to the group to get closer to meet its minimum, as opposed to the revenue model, which might make it more difficult because we're taking in the dollars toward that end. But regardless of that, as the bellwether, negotiating that minimum is key. So from the group's perspective, just making sure you're comfortable with that. And many hotels allow groups to modify their block, or maybe there's a right to mutually agree to modify the block. If that's something that you're going for, just make sure it's clear when it comes to the attrition clause. How do you calculate attrition? Is it based on the contracted amount, or is it based on the revised amount of the block, or of the revised amount of the room revenue? It's a key issue. And one trend I'm seeing, and this is something that many of you have seen here and there over the years, but I'm seeing more prevalently now, and that is attrition based on a nightly or per night room count, as opposed to a cumulative room count. So regardless of whether we're talking about the room count use or the room revenue use, if you see the word per night or you see the word nightly, that means that each night of a 4-night meeting, let's say, or stay, is going to be evaluated on its own as to that revenue amount or room count. You don't blend them together. You don't add up the highs, deduct the lows, you come up with a net number. Many of you are accustomed to thinking about things in a cumulative basis. And yet, again, likely because of the demand and compression in the marketplace, we're seeing hotels push for nightly attrition. So that's really difficult for groups. People check out early, that's going to hurt that night. People come in late, it's going to hurt that night. Obviously, a variety of other factors. So really focusing on those as components, you know, this is the bread and butter of the clause. It's kind of the main components, and looking at what you're using, looking at whether it's going to work for your association, likely booking conservatively on your block. I mean, if you're not going to have the ability to adjust the block and have attrition be based on that, or if attrition's got to be a really skinny cushion, like 10%, then you really want to make sure you're comfortable with your room block. Remind yourself that it's always a good problem to go shopping. Speaking of one who lives and dies by retail therapy, having to shop for rooms is a lot better than writing a check for attrition fees. And Lisa, I know from your perspective on attrition, you know, getting clients and groups to write checks can become a difficult prospect. So I know it's nothing that the hotels want to see either.
Right. And, you know, nobody wants an attrition check because hotels want heads and beds. And the first thing you have to remember is that if you're writing in a check for attrition, you're not making up for the hotel's loss, because convention guests present a different revenue stream to the hotel than transient guests. Convention guests stay in the hotel longer. They tend to spend more on ancillary revenues. And so loss of those guests that is being paid for with attrition damages doesn't make up for that loss. You also have to keep in mind that your attrition clause is based on the entire contract. The hotel is looking at what's the revenue you're going to generate, how many rooms, at what rate, and what are the concessions they're giving you. If you're only going to use half of the block that you're asking the hotel to hold for you for 6 months or a year or 2 years, if you're only going to use half of that, the hotel could have sold the other half to another customer and generated revenue. If you're only going to use half of that, the hotel would not have given you all of those concessions that you're asking for in that contract. And those concessions have real value. And so you need to look at the contract as an entire package of what it is you're committing to the hotel to provide. Now, Barbara talks about room night versus revenue. From my perspective, from the hotel's perspective, revenue is better because, again, we're looking at not numbers of rooms. We're looking at your revenue commitment to the hotel. And especially with these groups that want lowest rate guarantee clauses, and we can talk about that later. I'm of course against those, but you know, there's that issue. But if you come in at lower rates, the hotel is not getting that commitment that you made in the contract. What I am seeing a lot of customers ask, and hotels are willing to consider this, is, as Barbara mentioned, those room block review dates, so that a year out or 6 months out, as you're getting a handle on how your event is returning after COVID, you can adjust your room block. The hotel would much rather get those rooms back early and sell them to somebody else than have you write that check for attrition. But if you're getting down to the wire and suddenly you say, we're not going to meet our numbers, then that's not going to help the hotel. So you need to work together. And regardless of what your contract says, you always have the option to go to the hotel and say, look, based on what we're seeing, this isn't going to happen. And don't expect to just say, we want to release rooms back to the hotel. Don't owe us anything, or don't make us pay you anything. I'm sorry. Come back and say, we want to release some rooms, and in exchange for that, we'll give you some space back with it. Or we want to release some rooms, and in exchange from that, we'll give you some of the concessions back, so that it's a fair exchange. When you talk about post-COVID situations, people are worried about their attendance, but you have to keep in mind that the hotels are currently having some of the best transient rates than they've had ever. And so when they're holding the inventory for you and at the last minute they get it back, they can make up some of that revenue if they get it in time. So don't expect the hotel to be as anxious to give you a big attrition allowance as they were in the past, because that group booking may not mean what it used to mean in the past to them. So when Barbara talks about nightly attrition, she's right. Because of that transient push and because of the business travel that is returning to the marketplace right now, there are many times when a hotel can fill those rooms on a specific night if you don't use them. And so they want your commitment that you're going to fill those rooms on that night. I'm not seeing that often, but it is definitely a trend that is out there, especially in your big business cities where business travel is a big thing. So keep all that in mind. Come to the hotel with a clear idea of what you think your event is going to be. And I agree with Barbara. If you're concerned, rather than try to avoid an attrition clause, book a smaller event. And as Barbara says, it's a good problem to have to find additional rooms, rather than trying to lock in an attrition clause that leaves the hotel holding the bag if you don't fill your room block. Barbara, did I miss anything?
No, it's spot on, Lisa, as always. The good dialogue and ongoing one. We had a question in the chat with regard to, hey, I'm meeting the revenue number, the minimum, but I'm not meeting the room count number. And, certainly, what's working for your group, maybe revenue has been better in the past or room counts better, try to figure out what's going to work better. Maybe there's a way to draft the clause that could be either X, room count or the dollars. Certainly I think there's some opportunities there for looking at the clause, whether it's working for you, given the current climate. Last point is, don't ever cut off your nose to spite your face. A lot of groups will say, well, I have to book a block of this minimum amount in order to get these concessions or rate. If you're finding yourself doing that, that's a great, time for a timeout to say, is that really the best approach? Because I think a lot of cases, as you point out, it's better to go with the more conservative block, even if there's some additional cost associated with it, and figure out how to pay for those costs versus having to write a check for attrition. Sean?
Yeah, great points. And I forget the term you used, Barbara, but you refer to it as like almost like a check-in with your hotel partner to review kind of like the room block fill and to make sure that that quantity of rooms is still on point. So I thought that was a great recommendation as well. It seems like this question resonates a lot with a bunch of folks on today's webinar. So I'm glad we addressed that one first. Going to our next question. What are the most important coverage / issues to include in hotel MSAs? So I guess this is phrased almost as, what are the new most important coverages and issues to include in hotel MSAs?
And let me jump in on that, because when you talk about MSAs, you're saying that you as an organization has a master agreement that you want hotels to sign. From the hotel perspective, they really hate that, to be honest. They hate it when you submit your contract. They hate it when you submit your addendum. They want you to negotiate off of their standard contract. That's how the salespeople are trained. That's the way the hotel operates. So the minute you're starting to go off the hotel's paper, if you will, you're creating issues. Hotels do agree to MSAs for large clients. So if you want to have an MSA, if you want to have a pre-agreed contract with a hotel that you can use across the chain, you're going to have to provide something to the hotel to make it worth their while to do that. You're going to have to commit to a certain volume of business per year, and you're going to have to maintain that, or they're no longer going to honor the MSA. The MSAs, when you do get them, often give the customer things that wouldn't ordinarily happen in a standard hotel contract. Because you are such a good customer, you may get more wiggle room on attrition. You may get more concessions or things like that. But that minimum is going to have to be met in order to justify the hotel doing that. In terms of new clauses or coverage things in MSAs, it's no different than any other contract. You always have to have your basics of your attrition, your cancellation, your insurance, your indemnification. I always compare hotel contracts to like weddings. It doesn't matter if it's big or small. You still have to have a photographer. You still have to have a cake. You still have to have all those basic things. And the same is true in any event contract. You need to make sure that you have those basic clauses. And of course, the big thing now is the force majeure clause, which I'm sure we're going to talk about later. So, Barbara, what do you think?
Barbara, do you mind? I'm sorry to interrupt you. Do you actually mind, I think for the audience benefit, and Lisa kind of already defined it, I'm sure you were just about to do that before I rudely interrupted. Would you mind just defining for folks that might not be familiar with that acronym, what an MSA really is?
It usually means Master Services Agreement or some variation on that. And basically, it's a contract that is pre-negotiated, where you say these are the legal terms are pre-negotiated. Sometimes even the terms like attrition and cancellation are pre-negotiated in terms of percentages. And so every time you go to a hotel in that chain, you say, here's our MSA. It's pre-approved. We're not going to negotiate any of these terms. All we're filling in is dates, space, and rate, basically. Barbara?
Yeah, absolutely. And, agree with the definition. And those of you, whether you're corporate or association side on the planners, understand the strategy with any vendor. You negotiate up front all the legal terms so that you don't have to involve the lawyers anymore. Procurement loves them because all the terms are hanging out there. And then you're essentially adding in statements of work, scope of work orders, whatever you choose to call them, which really have the economic, the particulars, the dates, the block rates, etc. So there's a real benefit to streamlining the process. Having said that, my experience in working with clients over the years, negotiating these across the chains, is that in a lot of instances, the groups can do better with the one-offs, if you will. That is negotiating with the properties. Lisa mentioned, the heightened requirements on the hotel chain side to even get an MSA. All that said is, in terms of language and new clauses, it's really, I don't see anything that's new. I see things that might need to be enhanced or scaled down, as the case may be. So cancellation, attrition, if you look across the portfolio of meetings that your organization does, how many are small? How many are these short-term bookings, long-term bookings? How many are day only, rooms only, et cetera? mapping out your meeting portfolio is a good strategy because it does allow you from a business standpoint to go into the marketplace, to go with your RFP, your hotels, and really share the value of that meeting. And the terms that you have for that meeting, a short-term meeting, a small meeting, are going to be a lot different than a meeting that's very large, booked far out. And that's where I think templates can do a disservice to groups in general, just if they're not scaled properly. And I think it is important to scale a property. Often I'm posed the question, what clauses do I absolutely need in a contract that I'm booking 3 months out or less? What clauses do I need in a contract that I may be booking 3 years or more in advance? That type of thing. So if you haven't gone through that assessment internally, I think it's a good strategy because, again, I think it has useful value internally and externally as you talk with hotels and chains about the portfolio in your business. Really kind of being mindful of that is a good strategy. I just don't think I agree with Lisa. It's worth expending resources and negotiating these MSAs, but groups like hotels get all the time. Well, you guys agreed to this last year, or you accept the last year. We get it. Like there's a whole new game in town. There's a whole new sheriff in town. All that set aside is, always both sides benefit from contracts being scaled properly, being appropriate references, and that really should be the end goal. Sean?
And Barbara makes an interesting point about that because the hotels and the association or whatever it is spend all this time and money negotiating the MSA, and then for a particular event, as Barbara mentioned, maybe it's short term or long term or whatever it is, then the customer says, oh well, we need to change it for this. And the hotels get very frustrated. It's like either we have a pre-negotiated form or we don't. We're not going to start changing it. And again, I think it's clear from my perspective, I'm not a fan of them. I think there's a lot of reasons, and I think Barbara would agree with me that sometimes it's not very helpful.
Perfect.
And I saw, Sean, one of the questions in the chat was about, in that RFP process, is it good to put your clauses out there? And my response is, I would only put out clauses that are absolute 100% deal breaker type things. And maybe it's not even the clause itself. Maybe it's the concept. So for example, we need attrition to be based on 80% of the room pickup nights. We need X, as opposed to saying we need this walk clause or we need this force majeure clause. I think that having the points covered is a better strategy than actually saying we have to have these clauses, because at the end of the day, you may turn out to want to negotiate on those clauses to close the deal, and potentially you're throwing off folks who might otherwise bid on your business if they see it as an absolute. Lisa, I'm sure you get that a lot from hotel customers as well, asking about these required clauses that groups have.
We do. I had one just this week where the hotel sent their contract out, and the customer came back and said, well, here's our master agreement that has to be appended to every contract that we do. And I said to the hotel, did they even look at your contract? Because their master agreement had every clause in the hotel contract with just variations on it. It's like, why are we doing this? So I think Barbara's right. If there's a key thing that you need, whatever it is in your contract, as part of your RFP, say, this is a clause that is critical to us. And you're going to get a much better reaction than if you send out these master agreements that are conflicting with the hotel agreement.
Totally agree. And I'm glad that that question was actually asked, because we agree as well on the HopSkip side. Part of the RFP process on the HopSkip platform is exactly that. Planners have the ability to be able to communicate their requested contract clauses. And we also see planners utilize that as more so communicating the concept behind the clause and the deal breakers associated with the event, not necessarily going into the full on detail during the RFP process, as that gets ironed out when we get closer to the execution of the contract. So great question, and great to see the engagement so far in the chat as well.
And Sean, let me respond to something in the chat that somebody says, oh, why do hoteliers hate contracts? These are addenda, and these are things that the customer needs. What the hotel doesn't like is that they have their contract and then the customer has their addendum, and usually they want to stick them together and they're just opposite. What we would rather have is the hotel sends out its contract and you say, I think that this attrition clause is too hotel sided to hotel focused, let's negotiate that contract. Let's change the numbers rather than just sticking together two inconsistent documents. That's the reason that hotels don't like them. They would rather negotiate on their contracts and come up with something that both sides feel comfortable with than have two inconsistent documents put together. That was the point I was trying to make, and probably saying hate was not the best way I should have said it.
Well, I tell you, Lisa, I mean, the chat certainly, as it relates to the multiple documents, I absolutely agree too, as you do. One clean contract should be the goal. Whether you start with your paper, the hotel's paper, at the end of the day, one clean contract that integrates all the clauses. Otherwise, even if you have language saying, you know, if it's inconsistent in the contract, the addendum controls and vice versa, you and I have both been involved in kind of battles on that front. So integration of contracts is key. And, you know, I will say on the corporate side, you know, legal might come out with an addendum that you want to sort of slap on and fix everything in the contract. But as we've talked about over the years, that to me is not a best strategy. Integrating those clauses is what's key, because the reason we have these clauses in the contract, surprise here, we want them to be followed. And parking them in a 50-page addendum is not going to get it followed. So even just from a practical standpoint, I agree with all the discussion. Now, after the contract's signed, and you want to change the contract, that's the amendment document. And that does need to be a separate document. And you do want to go through that contract and make sure anything that could be impacted by the amendment is going to be addressed. So if you reduce your room block, making sure attrition shows on that front, that it translates or syncs with cancellation and the rest, that's a really important thing to do. Again, this is kind of blocking and tackling, but it is something that planners should focus on. Lisa, you and I kind of an agreement on some of these logistics over the years.
Absolutely, 100%.
Excellent. All right, next question. What clauses can you include in contracts that will cover the reduced service levels in hotels due to staffing issues when the original rates, minimums, etc., were contracted based on the hotel service levels pre-COVID?
Yeah, I'll jump in on this one too. You know, my feeling is, you know, not every problem, not every issue can be addressed in a contract or should be addressed in a contract. Having said that, I think some baseline placeholder language in the contract with regard to staffing or access to services, restaurants, facilities, and the like is a good strategy. But when you get into long detailed provisions about that, I think you're losing sight of really what's important. This issue, staffing, access to services, condition of the facility, should be monitored before, during, and after the meeting. You know, this is something an RFP, site selection, site inspection process, and then even ahead of the meeting. Many of you have heard me say, certainly since COVID, whatever your normal lead time is in doing your visit, you know, site inspection prior to the meeting, you need to either add a second visit or do it shorter, because you need to assess on site prior to the meeting, but just not at the pre-con. That's just not enough time, because the goal is to make adjustments, ask the hotel to fix things, change things, whatever the case may be, before the meeting, because we want to avoid whatever problems might be caused by that. On site at the meeting, it's just going to be difficult police. And there's no way to articulate what it meant that folks had to wait in line an extra hour to check in. What does that have a financial value, right? You know, to articulate that is really impossible. So I really think these issues, which I acknowledge are issues for a whole variety of reasons, labor shortage, you know, hotels reopening, you know, hotels being affected or by damage, et cetera. All those things are real, but to me, having, you know, the contract isn't necessarily the best way to address these issues. Again, I think good placeholder language is there, but I think really it's a practical issue of continuously monitoring, which I know groups, you know, there's a cost to that, obviously, to groups. This is something I would include in, you know, negotiations. If there's an extra, you know, comp room for a site inspection or whatever the case may be, these are things to ask for, because that to me is the best way to police it. And I know, Lisa, you and I talked about these issues over the years as these things have come up of the difficulty in kind of trying to draft and negotiate clauses which have more specificity on things like service or staffing.
It's very hard to contract for things like service, because service is very subjective in terms of what you think is good service and bad service. I don't think it's helpful to say that you have a clause that says you will have staffing at 2019 levels, because staffing is based on occupancy. And so when the hotel is running at 20%, it's not going to have the same level of staffing as it had when it was running at 100%. On the other hand, you do have a right to expect that there's going to be sufficient staff there to service your event. And like Barbara said, that's something I think is best done by your site visits, by your communications. I had a situation where a customer was very concerned because the hotel had been closed for COVID for an extended period, and they wanted to know that staffing was going to be sufficient for their event. So they had a special site visit where they met with the GM, they met with the hotel's union representative, met with department heads for everybody that was going to service their event to talk about how they were going to get the service levels where they wanted them to be so that the group could be comfortable. You also have to remember that it may be that outlets are not operated by the hotel and they can't dictate what their hours are going to be. Now, at the end of the day, if the hotel comes up short, if everybody calls in sick or they're unable to fill positions, as many of you have heard, hotels are struggling to do that, there may be a service deficiency. And for that, you deserve some kind of compensation. That's something that as you approach the event, as Barbara said, you should be talking about. But during the event, you need to be communicating with people at the hotel. You need to be saying to the general manager, you know, the service last night or even at this event is not very good. What are you going to do about it? And you should be expecting some kind of an accommodation for that. Now, I understand that from the planner perspective, they're saying after the fact compensation is not what we're worried about. We want our attendees to be happy. And I certainly agree with you, and you should have that expectation. And that's where that communication in advance comes in, asking the hotel what their staffing level is, asking if they're having problems, asking if there's things that you need to be preparing for as the event gets closer. I agree with Barbara. You can put something into the clause, but I think the most important thing is that communication as the event is approaching and during the event to deal with the issues as they are. The hotel is not out there trying to understaff for your event. They want to have full staff. They want to have everything working well, but we're going through difficult times with those staffing levels, and everybody needs to work together to try and work through it.
Yeah. And Lisa, I've just add to that, you know, in terms of benchmarking in the contract, if it's important to your group that there are the 4 restaurants on site that are open over a particular amount of hours or days, that's something certainly you could bake into the contract. You know, if there's a glossy picture on the website and you want it to look like that, can you attach to the contract? Of course. So, you know, benchmark as you will the things that are important. You know, make sure hotels understand, for example, we don't provide a lunch on this day. So we're going to need, these folks have an hour. We're going to need somewhere where they can go. And if it's the outlet that they can't control, then let's set up mobile concession carts or you name it, whatever the case may be. Sometimes I think there's a communication gap there. So for groups, go ahead and be as express as you want. But the post afterwards dollar amount remedies, while certainly we get those and negotiate those, we all know that's not going to take care of the problem. So I think you do both. I think you want to put benchmark language in your contract, but you're also policing in the manner that Lisa mentioned, and communicate the problem, communicate the issue, if you will, from the group's perspective. Just kind of like I explained with that, you know, the 1 hour for lunch and, you know, being practical about that. Because I think that's the kind of stuff that Lisa, you know, sharing with hotels resonates more than it might do if it's just having this blanket language about, you know, stuff being open all the time and the rest.
As always, great responses. Let's go to the next question. Due to the current economic climate, more clients are asking for economic downturn language as a way to reduce or eliminate their financial obligation to the contract. Is that something you are seeing across the industry?
Let me jump in on that because that's something that has come and gone over the years. And the thing you need to remember is a contract is a commitment. A contract is an allocation of risk. You are agreeing today on a futures agreement that says, I'm reserving these rooms and space and making these minimums for an event in the future. And you are obligated to that, whether it turns out your deal is better or worse than you expected. That's the whole point of a contract. You're locking in things now so that in the future, things won't change. Whenever a customer asks for these economic downturn clauses, I just say, sure, I'll give you one of those if you agree that we can raise the rate if rates are higher. And of course, I've never gotten that from a customer because they're saying, no, we want this guaranteed rate. We just want it to be lower if the economy changes. Well, the good news right now is rates are at the highest levels they've ever been in most places, and transient business is off the charts. So the risk of rates being lower is really small. But in terms of economic downturn, again, that's not a contract term that's appropriate because you need a firm, definite commitment in your contract. The hotel doesn't have the obligation to reduce your obligations if the economy turns out to be bad any more than the hotel can force you to pay higher rates if the economy turns out to be good. I'm seeing these clauses coming up right now a lot, and every hotel that I know is saying no to them because, again, it's not definite business. If you've got a clause like this in your contract, the hotel has to go to its owners and say, well, we have this event that's worth $100,000 unless the economy changes, in which case it may only be worth $60,000. We can't have that kind of business on the books. And so it probably makes your contract legally unenforceable because you don't have any minimum commitment in the contract. So for a lot of reasons, these clauses are not going to be helpful to you. And I'm sure Barbara's going to say, instead of requesting something like this, book more conservatively so you don't have to worry about those kinds of issues. But I'll let Barbara say that. Barbara,
Lisa, I mean, you're absolutely right on that front, but I think, the clause gets to a number of the provisions that you highlighted. One is sort of the lowest best rates clause. Others coming in the chat, are we going to get credit for rooms outside the block, for attrition, comp room count, et cetera? I mean, the list goes on, in other words, where an economic downturn could hurt the group. To me, it doesn't matter if what's causing, maybe if you look at it this way, it doesn't necessarily matter what's causing the potential, the concern the group has is not folks coming to stay in the block to satisfy their commitments. So the way to address that, regardless of why that's happening, the way to address that is that flexibility we talked about, flexibility in the room block, flexibility to adjust the block. When it comes to the rate, my guidance has always been negotiate the best rate possible. The best rate clauses, there are so many holes and exceptions that I can't remember, I should say, in recent past where we've ever tried to invoke that clause because it's just so difficult to invoke. Getting credit for the rooms coming in the door regardless, yes. And if a hotel is just turning a blind eye to rates, at other hotels and they're not willing to even consider that as part of room block management, then I think that's something you raise before the fact, as a way to say, help me help you, right? Fill the block. So I think those are still conversations which should have, when it comes to economic downturn, does that mean you're not going to have your meeting at all? Are we talking about cancellation? Should we negotiate a cancellation fee schedule that works for you? Are we talking about putting it into force majeure, which, sometimes I see it clouded in there where it'll say, cancellation solely for economic downturn. Well, solely, right? Now we get into debate on whether it was solely due to that or something else. So to me, I think setting aside the why and building the flexibility, hope for the best, plan for the worst. I think that's what this says. And I think these are areas in which the group can do, can address these without having to put economic downturn kind of, open language and pink neon flashing lights. Like you focus more on what do you want to do about it?
And I'm seeing in the chat people asking about things about rate integrity or hotels incentivizing people to book outside the block or things like that. Again, the rooms outside the block are not getting free meeting space. They're not getting concessions. They're not getting all the things that are part of that group contract commitment. And so those rooms aren't comparable to the rooms inside your block. What more and more groups are doing is saying, if you want to attend this meeting, you have to reserve inside the official room block. And then the availability of other rooms doesn't matter anymore because it's a cost of doing business. If you want to come to this event, you have to reserve inside the room block at the specific rate. And people that are attending meetings need to understand that that meeting space that they're sitting in is not free. It's part of the overall commitment that the transient guest that's paying less doesn't get. And there's always been rooms available at other rates. If people want to find rooms available at other rates, they're going to find them. So what the meeting planners need to do, instead of talking about this rate integrity, they need to incentivize their people to book within the block or require them to book within the block. There really is no such thing as rate integrity. You don't have a right to the lowest rate. If a hotel has 500 rooms and you're booking 60 of them, the hotel can sell those other rooms at whatever rate it wants, and you're not entitled to any matching of that rate. Just like, as I've said before, if you're booking rooms at $100 and the hotel is selling its other inventory at $200, it can't make you raise your rate to $200. So it works both ways. So that's when we're talking about this economic downturn, look at what Barbara's saying, negotiate other things rather than including these kinds of things in your contract.
Anything?
Yeah, and I'll just say, you've heard me say from the group side, Lisa, the fix for booking, through the group for hotels and everything isn't for every group. And, sometimes it's a matter of people affording to come to the conference. But to me, that just speaks to, if you're booking at a destination, there's a lot of lower priced options down the street. You shouldn't be booking as many rooms at the principal hotel, right? If folks are going to do that. So I do think it all kind of comes back to center, which is really, evaluation on both sides of the groups, but agree with you on the rate integrity. And I agree that, this is something that is best addressed, at least on the group side, through other ways. What's your real concern, and negotiating on that basis.
Awesome. Great to see all the engagement in the chat. We appreciate it, and please keep it coming. This is all good feedback as well for our next webinar. Okay, hoteliers, this poll question is for you. What is your top challenge in booking events today with your planner partners? I believe the poll is launched. No responses yet. I know that there we go. I was going to say, I know there's some hoteliers on today's webinar. It looks like the top answer so far, no surprise here, is agreeing on clauses and terms, followed by incomplete RFPs and being able to connect directly with the meeting planner. But agreeing on clauses and terms is definitely ranking at the top response. Okay, for the sake of time, we're going to keep it moving. The next question is, when you're presented legalese in a contract, how best to handle it so both sides understand what it means to avoid disputes or issues later? Any recommendations, Barbara or Lisa, on this one?
Well, ideally, there's no term in a contract, no word used, no term used that you don't fully understand, and your negotiating opponent, if you will, doesn't fully understand. In other words, acronyms, long words that no one knows what they mean, really do a disservice to both sides. If your legal eagle has empowered you with a contract language you can't understand, you can't communicate, you can't sell, that's a disservice on their part. You really should have contracts which function for you, and you are able to explain why it is you need a certain provision. Having said that, boilerplate, as often gets kind of kicked around in contracts, means a lot. And in fact, many of you have experienced that over the last 2 years. You might not have paid attention to a clause like prevailing party attorney's fees, which sounds like a fancy term, but all it means is that the loser pays the winner's attorney's fees and their own. So, we're not necessarily going to write it that way, but that's really what it means. And maybe in a dispute that's hurt you as a group, or maybe a particular dispute resolution has hurt you. Whatever the case may be, it's really important to understand all the terms. And it isn't, if the legal legals aren't empowering you to do that, I would challenge them to do that, because it is hurting your organization if you're not able to negotiate the best terms, or be able to go back and say, look, we can't get this term the way we want it. It's going to look like this instead. Is it okay? And I think that's the alternative. So I look at these terms. I agree that if you see terminology, it's not user-friendly, you can't explain it, that's your trigger. That's something you either need to know more about it, or can it be rewritten in such a way that it will be able to communicate the issue? Because again, at the end of the day, we're writing these contracts so they could be enforced. And if there's going to be a question on enforcement because of the way it's written, that in and of itself is a problem.
I agree with Barbara. The point here is every contract clause, you should be able to explain to somebody else why it's there and what it does. So the cancellation clause is there because it tells what happens in the event that the group decides it's not going to have the event at the hotel. That's what it's there for, and it sets forth the amounts that you would owe based on the date that you cancel your event. If you can't explain something that simply to somebody about a clause, then you need to get more help and get more advice. Indemnification clauses simply explain when you have to pay the other party for a loss or an injury that you cause. If you don't understand that, that's something you need to find out more about, and you need to discuss with your legal, as Barbara would say, how it applies and what it means. You should never include anything in a contract that you don't understand what its implications are for your client or whoever it is that you're working for. These clauses have been here for a long, long time. There's all kinds of industry resources out there that will help you understand them if you don't understand them. There are a few cases where they're what I like to call legal magic words, things that are very important to have in the contract that should not be changed because they can have legal implications. But those are relatively few in most event contracts, indemnification, some dispute resolution, things like that. So again, I agree with Barbara. Make sure you understand. If you don't understand, get help, and make sure that you can explain those clauses to somebody else. It's also a good idea to talk with your counterpart on the other side and say, this is my understanding of this clause. Is that how you interpret it? And if they don't interpret it the same way, you need to redo that clause to make sure that you both have the same understanding of what's going to happen.
I should also mention too on that, I know, not being a meeting planner ourselves, we had to get educated from Barbara and Lisa on, the most common contract clauses, terms. And one of the things that we built in HopSkip to help educate planners on the most common contract terms and clauses is a contract clause education center within the HopSkip platform. So for any of the HopSkip customers that are on today's webinar, you have that available on the platform today. For any folks that are interested in checking it out, I believe we put a demo link in the chat. So feel free to reach out to us, and we're happy to show you a contract clause education center that addresses all of the main clauses, defines them, and provides a perspective from both the group and the hotel side. I'm going to flip to the last slide here. We have 3 minutes left. This is the last question, so we'll keep this one concise. But we thought this was interesting to address. So if a hotel is sold and the new owners take away one tower for use, resulting in a loss of sleeping rooms and meeting rooms agreed to in your contract, what resources do we have as planners? Is the entire contract in breach?
Let me jump in real quick, and then I'll toss it to Barbara. If you've reserved 500 rooms and the hotel can only give you 200 rooms, I would say that's a material breach, and you probably are excused from your contract. If the hotel has committed 500 rooms and they can only give you 400 or 450, they're in breach. But would that allow you to cancel the entire contract? Maybe not. It would really depend, again, on all those circumstances. The typical thing that happens is that the hotel understands that it has an obligation to you, and it will work with you to find the other rooms and pay the damages that you incur as a result of that. It's very rare for these kinds of situations to ever end up in litigation because the hotel understands that they are not fulfilling their contractual commitment, and they will work with you to resolve that situation. Barbara?
I agree with you, Lisa, and I'd say to the group, what do you want my answer to be? Do you want to walk away? Is it so material, so different in what you're getting that you need, your product isn't the same, you need to put this valuable asset you're meeting at a different property? Then we work toward that end. We look at a breach. Is it a breach? We excuse performance, or we look to get recovered damages from the hotel. If the answer is no, we want to stay, then we work accordingly in negotiating concessions or other arrangements in order to stay. I think, to me, that's the question that's often posed. We could talk all day about, legal contract law and material breach and whether there's an opportunity to cure or fix a breach. But my question to groups is pretty simple. If this scenario is happening 30 days out, this group likely can't move anyway. If this scenario is happening 6 months out, the group could move, but then my response, as yours might be, Lisa, on the hotel side is, but we're going to have it open. We're going to have it ready. So there's always lots of debate in this area. And again, I go back to that soul searching, at least I've advocated on my client's part, to say, what do you want the answer to be? And work in that direction. And typically having those dialogues, and the hotels don't make those calls unless they have to. And usually when they're making those calls, they've got a fix in mind, right? A remedy in mind. And, then the group can evaluate whether that would work for them.
Awesome. Guys, we are at the hour mark and we finished all questions. So thank you firstly to Barbara and Lisa for another great webinar. Everybody appreciates your input. And thank you to everyone who attended today's session live. We will be distributing a recorded version of the webinar early next week. And we look forward to seeing you on our next one. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great rest of your day and happy Friday.
Thanks.
Thank
All
you.
right.
Bye. Bye.